Hi, my name is Jeff Harlig. I'm the director of the Cal State San Marcos Writing Center. What you're about to see is one of a series of videos on writing prepared with San Marcos faculty. In this series, you'll hear faculty from several departments on campus talking about the whole range of the writing process. In my years as a teacher and counselor, it's become clear to me that when students get a writing assignment, they often don't really know what's expected of them. They may not know why they're writing, and they may not know what the finished product is supposed to be like. For that reason, I decided to talk directly to faculty and ask them questions like these. Why do you ask students to write? What are your expectations for writing, especially as regards the conventions of your own field? And finally, what's the role of writing in your own life and work? Our hope is that some of the mystery of the writing process can be cleared up by hearing answers to questions like these from the people who know best. Let's listen in now.
What I've found in my years of learning is that learning has different steps. And one of the steps is acquiring information. And another step is comprehending and digesting that information and then putting it back out there in a form that you create. And that can be, in my classes, it's going to be a writing assignment. In a performing arts class or a music class or any form of art class, it might be, it'll be a piece of art. But whether it's a piece of art or it's a paper, in order to produce something yourself, you have to reflect and you have to understand something new and you have to want to give your own spin to it in a way that is in some way comprehensible to somebody else. And so the writing requirement is our campus's way, I think, of acknowledging that the biggest step of learning, the most important step that happens in learning is when you take the information that you've acquired, and whether it's information like for a research paper in the social sciences, or information from an experiment in a lab, or information from the process of learning about creation of art, and you take it in and then you put something else back out that incorporates what you've taken in, that information, the lab experiment results or the artistic experience, and it's shaped in a new way by you. And so the writing requirement is the way that we actually take the information and take our biggest learning step. It's for many people, it's the hardest thing to do, and it's hard for a reason. It's legitimate. I always tell my students, yes, this is hard. It's hard for me too when I write. It's much easier to read what someone else wrote, and to even just to think about what they wrote or to talk about it with other people. But when you have to write, you have to have something to say, and then you have to really think. And that's when you make connections. And the deepest connections happen when you do that creative process, whether it's writing a paper or doing an improvisation or creating a sculpture. That's when you grow, and growing is hard. So I think that our campus has made the right decision, from the get-go, that we distinguish ourselves from other campuses by saying we recognize explicitly that step is the most important step. We're going to make sure it happens in every class. A long time ago, I decided that I didn't like to assess my students' work with exams. I think exams and tests have a place in certain disciplines, and I can see how they can be used well in math or in direct problem solving. But I stopped giving tests and exams about 20 years ago, and I only have students write papers. And there are no tests or exams in any of my classes. All the assessment is based on papers that students write and on their work in the classroom. Well, my students, all my writing assignments involve the students having to take some steps beyond what is provided to them in the class. It's not enough to just read and listen to what happens in class. They have to think about, and then they have to put together pieces of material that aren't provided for them. So if I ask them to do a research paper, it's not going to be a case study on something that's in a textbook that they have already read and they can just sort of digest it and make a summary of. They're going to have to gather information and put it together themselves in a paper that's unique to them, that's original to them. So that's what a paper is in the social sciences, the way that I view it. It's not about their opinions, it's not about their feelings, it's about what can they learn by collecting data from what other people have researched, or from newspapers, from other academics, the writing of other academics, from scientific databases or government websites, collecting information on a topic, and then figuring out how to write that up in a way that's interesting and that tells me something about a situation that I have assigned them to write about or learn about. When you write a paper, there has to be a reason that you're writing it. And a thesis statement is one way to create a structure for your paper. A thesis statement is a position. It lays out a position that you've arrived at based on your research. So if we go back to this idea of the Colorado River Delta, which is the place where the Colorado River ends, and every river ends at an ocean, and the place where it ends at an ocean, that's called the delta. And many rivers are drying up, and then their deltas are not getting enough water. This actually matters for environmental reasons. I'm not going to go into this here. But if you're going to write a paper on why it's drying up, you might have some thinking based on what you've read about why that is. Is it because politicians in Washington have decided that the water of the Colorado River is going to be used for American industry? And then you can say, the Colorado River Delta is drying up, and the argument of this paper is that it's decisions made in Washington that are leading to that. And that right there, that's just a sentence, but it lets you structure your paper, because then now you know, what are you going to do in this paper? You're going to try to prove that that's the case. So you're going to have some evidence, you're going to have some data that, from congressional records or law proceedings or somewhere that shows that this is happening. On the other hand, you could have a different argument. The argument could be that it's drying up because of climate change. And then you would have different data, and that would structure your paper differently. You might say the Colorado River Delta is drying up because the climate's getting hotter, and it's not snowing as much, so we don't have a snowpack, and the river isn't running with as much water, and it doesn't reach the delta. But then you would be looking for other information, and you'd be structuring your paragraphs and building your argument about how the climate has changed over the last 100 years and how much water there is in the river. So having your thesis statement is just a way to make a decision about what your paper is about and what you're going to try to show in your paper. You can keep coming back to that as you're writing each paragraph. You can come back and say, "Ooh, is this paragraph helping me explain what I think what I said I was going to do?" So the thesis statement is a statement of is a position that you're going to argue in the paper. That's all that it is. And if you don't have some kind of argument, then what are you writing your paper about? Because we don't really do just book reviews. Book review is how you learn to write in elementary school, where you just summarize what someone else did, and that's important to know how to do. But when you're writing a social science paper, you're doing more than just summarizing one person's work. You might have 5 or 6 people's work, and you have to take from each of them. And how do you know what to take? And you only know what to take if you have figured out what it is you want to try to argue. I mean, that means every paper, every journal article written by an academic will have something in the way of a thesis statement. They won't say the thesis of this paper, of this article is, sometimes they will, but they'll say this, the argument, yes, every journal article will have some kind of position. Every scientific article, every medical journal article has something they're trying to show. And they're going to use data to try to show it or to disprove it. So yes, and for example, I always tell my students, so you're not going to be an academic, you're going to graduate from college, and maybe you'll end up being the manager of Firestone Tires. And at some point you'll be asked to write a report on your branch and how it's doing. And you're going to want to build an argument. And you will want to build an argument that your branch is doing really well, right? You're not going to want to just say, we're kind of lackadaisically, moving along here. You're going to want to say, you're going to want to sit down and look at your data and say, how can I best present this to make the case that I'm a good manager? And that's your thesis. So it doesn't matter what job you're in, there's going to be writing. And the writing, you're going to have to figure out what it is that you're trying to say, whether you're working at McDonald's or Firestone or in a hospital or as a professor. Yeah. So the first thing, when I start reading a paper, I'm open-minded. I have no predisposition or sense about whether it's going to be good or bad. I'm looking forward to it being good. I'm hoping it's good. The first thing that I'm reading, I'm starting at the beginning. It's the introduction. The introductory paragraph it's not necessarily a predictor. You can have a really good introductory paragraph and things can go downhill, but a good introductory paragraph is a very satisfying thing to read because it tells me a number of things. There is some kind of argument or thesis, or the student is making the case why the topic matters. The student is telling me what the paper is going to be about, like what are the parts of the paper. The introduction is well written. It's got correct grammar and syntax, correct spelling. If needed, the student has cited their sources. And it might even be creative, and that's a really nice thing where there's some interesting writing. The introduction should pull me in. So as I continue to read the paper, I'm thinking about the prompt for the paper. I'm thinking about what did I ask students to do? And I usually have both open on my screen. I have my assignment open, and then I have another section of the screen which is the student paper. And I'm always double checking because I don't necessarily trust my memory. My papers have multiple parts. So I'll read my own handout and I'll refresh my memory before every paper and say, okay, you got to look for these things. And then I'm looking for them. And being the professor, I know that there's a certain order that often works better. There's a certain organization that is sort of logical. And I try to lay out the guidelines for my papers in that logical order so that if students just follow it, they're going to have an organized paper. And I tell them that. I tell them, I'm trying to show you what it's like to outline a paper. My handout is an outline. If you follow it, you'll have an organized paper. So I'm looking for a logical sequence. There's a way that you build an argument. There's a beginning, middle, and end. And there can be more than one way to do that. But there are also ways to do that wrong, where the information is kind of scattered everywhere and it isn't clear what the student is doing with information. It doesn't build up well. So a good paper follows, there's some evidence that the student thought about what order would make sense here. And it's like building blocks. It's like you wouldn't build a pyramid starting with just a tiny block and then try to put a big base over it. You have to have a big base and then you can build on that. And somehow a good paper does that. It starts and it builds and it builds and it builds. And then within each paragraph, there's also structure, and I'm really aware of that. As I read, I automatically can tell that the paragraph has a topic sentence, and that topic is the next topic in the paper, and that it's a sensible next topic. And then that paragraph is going to speak to that topic. And so a poor paper doesn't. A poor paper has a topic sentence, and then the student doesn't know what to do next and gets distracted and brings in material that isn't relevant to that topic sentence. And now we have lost the argument. So a good paper, the paragraphs go in an order that makes sense. Within each paragraph, there's a topic sentence, and then there's information in the paragraph about that topic, and then there's some kind of conclusion to the paragraph that leads to the next paragraph. So when it all progresses well like that, and it's well written, and the student has proofread, and it's spelled correctly, and there are citations, and the data is fairly recent or recent enough, you've got a good paper. And then you get to a conclusion that kind of restates something important, an ending, and a bibliography where everything is properly laid out in an acceptable bibliographic form, and that's an A paper. What makes the social sciences a science is that we base our thinking on data. And the data that we gather is about the social world. So we're the social sciences, whereas the hard sciences are gathering different sorts of data. And the data that students in college can get, that anyone can use really, there are two sorts of data. They're called primary and secondary. And primary data is when you do the research yourself. Like if I sent my students out and told them to go across campus with a survey and pick 10 students, 5 men, 5 women, and ask each of them where they think San Diego gets its water, then my students would be doing primary research. They would be gathering their own data, and they could come back then and they could look at that and say, well, across 10 students, how many got the right answer? How many knew? How many women knew? How many men knew? And if they got information about the age of the students or what year they were in college, they could say, well, seniors tended to know more, or freshmen knew less, or women knew more, or men knew more. So then they can analyze, that's primary data. So that's one source of data. Now, in my classes, we don't usually have the opportunity to get primary data, so what we're doing is we're using data that other people have gotten, and that's called secondary data. So my students do a lot of library research, and that library research isn't necessarily done in the library anymore, it's done on their computers. But we work very closely with the librarians, and we teach students how to access databases of journal articles written by academics who have gone out and gathered the data. And so when they're writing a paper, whether it's a paper on the Colorado River Delta or a paper on the transition to democracy in Mexico, it's not something that they know, so they have to learn about it, and the way they learn about it is reading what other people have researched and written about. And so we don't use magazine articles. We use sources that we feel are reputable in terms of the quality of the data that they have. And data doesn't have to mean numbers. It can mean the data is an article by a foreign policy analyst writing his impressions of transition to democracy in Mexico. And if he's someone who has worked on Mexico for 30 years, then his impressions are important, and they constitute data. And so in the social sciences, we gather information and then we try to digest it and reflect on it. And that's what we're doing in our papers. Whether you're a student in a social science class or a professor writing a paper, you are reflecting on the world around you in some way, and you're doing that, trying to be rigorous in some way about it, and not just giving your opinion. What I try to explain to students is that what we're doing in college is we're not using our opinions. We're gathering information to try to make reasoned judgments about things. And the only way to make a reasoned judgment about anything is to look at it carefully from different points of view and gather information on it. And so when students sometimes say, well, my opinion is as good as yours, then I always say to them, your reasoned judgment is as good as mine. So I have been thinking about this for a long time. I'm older than you are, and I'm an academic. So I can explain to you how I came to my conclusions. So you might think that's my opinion, but it's more honest to say it's my reasoned judgment, because I can tell you how I got there and what my evidence is, and yours is as good as mine. So if you tell me that you have also done some reading and done some thinking, and here's what you read, and now you have some thoughts about it, that's reasoned judgment. But if you tell me you heard it on, Fox News, and you believe that, and now it's your opinion, that's not reasoned judgment. And so, in the social sciences, we're learning how to reason and then make judgments, based on evidence. When you write papers, you're going to be gathering material from research that other people have done, and you're going to be bringing that material together and compiling it in your own way in an original paper written by you. But every semester I find that there are students who have trouble with this, and what I want to do here is show you some of the common mistakes that students make. And so what we have on the screen right now is page 1 of a student paper that was submitted to Turnitin. And a lot of times you'll be asked to submit your papers to Turnitin, and this is what it looks like when we, the professors, look at your papers, and I think it's good for students to get to see this. You can see it yourself, by the way. When you submit your paper, you can go to this tab on the top left that says Originality, and I think students probably have it in that same location, but I'm not sure. And if you click on Originality, which I have done as the professor, Turnitin will tell you how much of your paper is original and how much is not. And it's going to be in a number over here. This one says that it's 67% similar, meaning that, in fact, very little of this paper is original, that only 33% is original and 67% is not. And that sets off an alarm bell right away, because it means that the student didn't write the paper in his or her own words. So what do I see? And again, you'll see this too. So if you would use Turnitin, or if you're asked to, you can figure this out before the professor sees it. So what Turnitin does is it highlights in a particular color everything that comes from an author other than the student. So this page alone has lavender and pink and light blue and olive green and sort of peach. And that means that there are 5 different authors who have written the material on this paper, and it lists them over here on the right-hand side. So the purple, if I want to know where it comes from, I would look and I would say, that must be maybe this from Wild Coast, and the pink comes from this source over here, and this blue comes from this source over here. But most importantly, what I see is that the entire page is in color, and that tells me that the student didn't write anything on this page herself. Everything on this page was written by somebody else. And the student might have done a really good job of finding all these sources that have really good information for the paper that she was assigned. And then she found maybe, really good sections within each of these sources that's relevant to the paper she was assigned. And she then copied word for word from the source what they had to say about the topic, and she strung it together into a page worth of material. Again, nothing written by her. But she was really careful to tell the professor and to cite where did she find this material. So if you notice, after each sentence, there is a careful citation that tells us, and in fact it matches, it is Wild Coast. And so this student, this page with all this color is plagiarized. Everything on this page is copied from someone else, and that's what plagiarism is. But this student is telling me where she found the material. There's another citation, there's another citation, there's another one. So she's really, really good at providing the citations. And when I graded this paper, I said to myself, this student did not intend to plagiarize, because a student who intends to plagiarize never provides all these careful citations. But it is plagiarism nonetheless. And the important thing for you to know as a student is you never want to do this, because this is grounds for an F on the paper, an automatic F in the class, and being reported to the Dean of Students, where they'll create a file for you, so that if you ever do this again and you're reported, there'll be evidence of the history that you've done it. So you don't ever want that to happen to you. Therefore, you want to be really careful that if you use someone else's words, you put those words in quotes, because then at least it's legal, and you have said these words were written word for word by someone else, and I'm telling you this by using quotation marks at the beginning and the end of every quote. But there's another problem. Do you think this paper would be okay if it was all in quotes? And the answer is no, because if this page was all quotes, then the same problem would exist if the student hadn't written anything herself. Now, it wouldn't be plagiarized, but it wouldn't be original. And so we're going to look at another paper now in which a student used quotation marks, but the paper still is problematic. This paper, I'm also looking at it on Turnitin in the Originality view. And you can see some color here. So here's this peach, green, peach, and that tells us right away these sections, Turnitin believes them to be plagiarized. So on this page, there seems to be a lot of text without any color, so presumably it's original. And then we've got the plagiarized part, so let's have a look at that. We have 3 different problems on one page. At the top, the first line and a half is in peach. So it tells us that it comes from, I think it comes from this source over here. And there is no citation. So this is a case where the student word for word copied what was written by someone else, and didn't cite their source, and that, means that it might be harder to discover where it came from, but Turnitin found it. Now, the green here is a different case. In the green, the student also plagiarized, writing word for word, taking word for word what another author said, but telling me where they got that, and that was Costa 2000. So that's still plagiarism, but here the student was very careful to say where they got the material, and in this next paragraph, which is almost all highlighted in this peach color, again there's a citation, and in this case again the student is indicating where they got the citation, but it's still plagiarism. So this is a problem. This whole top half is a problem. But, unfortunately, the rest of this page is not written by the student either, because now the student has a paragraph in which the entire paragraph is a quote. And here's the beginning of the quotation mark over here and the end quotation mark over here. So having a very long quote in a paper isn't in and of itself a problem. What matters is how many quotes you have and how long the paper is. What's problematic with this page is that this is another case where the student didn't write anything on the page. So whether it's plagiarized here without a citation, plagiarized here with citations, or in quotes, not a single word in this entire section was written by the student. This happens to have been a 4-page paper, and so in this case, if this had been the only part of the paper with this problem, it still would have been 25% of the paper, would have been 1/4 of the paper not written by the student, and that's not okay. So no matter how we cut the cake, this isn't okay for this paper. Maybe if the student had written a 50-page paper and had a really long quote like this, that would be fine. The best policy really is don't quote, use your own words. The most you can use your own words, the more you can use your own words, the stronger your paper is going to be. And there are very few times in college writing where you have to use someone else's words. The only time that you'd really want to put a quote in is when another author has said something so relevant to your paper in such a beautiful and special way that you want to use their words, that using your own words just can't do it justice. And then you might do that for a line or two. You really never, in a social science paper of under 10 pages, would have an entire paragraph like this that's a quote. Most of the time when you read a paragraph like this, you'll find you can say it yourself in your own words. And maybe when you do that, in fact, most likely when you do that, it's going to fit the assignment better because you'll be writing it for the assignment, while this author was writing it for his paper or his book, which might not be and won't be your professor's assignment. So in this paper, again, to reiterate, this is a problem and this student is not going to do well because nothing here is written by the student himself. In this paper, the student did not plagiarize. The student had no plagiarism, and so that's not an issue. The problem in this paper is that the student quoted so much that very little of the paper was written in the student's own words. And we're going to look at an example of this with this top paragraph. So I'm going to read this out loud for a little bit to give you the idea. And so she says, "Issues that plagued the Salton Sea began when humans tried to control the Colorado River." That's a nice topic sentence, by the way. Open quote. "The sea itself formed in 1905, a result of unanticipated Colorado River floods eroding an unprotected diversion." End quote. "Then after 2 years," open quote, "the river was brought under control." End quote. "This area was no stranger to an inflow of water." Open quote. "Before 1900, the river periodically emptied northwest into the Salton Basin, forming a body of water known as Lake Coahuila." End quote. Open quote. "Left on its own, the water in the sea would have eventually evaporated," end quote, "as it has done in the past. Instead, when the elevation of the sea began to lower," open quote, "Congress acted to designate the lands within the Salton Basin as storage for waste and seepage from irrigated lands," end quote. Now I think you get the idea here that in the lines that I've read, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there might be a total of a line and a half of her own words. Everything else was written by somebody else. And she's very careful to tell me whom. Again, very good with citations, okay? All the citations are there. But this is not, the assignment was not to find a lot of quotes and string them together as best you can. the assignment was to write a paper on the Salton Sea. And the assumption is that the student's going to write the paper. Now, it's one thing to find your sources and highlight them, and to think that the information is relevant and important, but you don't write a paper by taking word for word these clauses from another author and stringing them together with a few of your own words, and then having a paragraph in which almost everything is in quotes. And I don't even know how many little subquotes there are here, but there are many, and that is not the student's own writing. So that is as big a problem. It's a different problem from plagiarism. It's not illegal, but it's not original. And therefore, it can't be graded, because I can't grade this since the student didn't write it. And I have to send it back to the student and tell the student to write it themselves, which doesn't mean just changing a word here and there and removing the quotes. It means thinking about what the paragraph is about, going to the highlighted parts of her notes, and then stepping back and thinking, how would I tell someone about this if I wanted to tell them about it? I bet I can write this in my own words. And I know that students can't, because my other students do, and then writing it herself. And that's what the student is going to be doing in order to get this paper graded. So this is problem number 3, and that is excessive use of quotations. And it isn't just in this paragraph, by the way, it's throughout the paper, and that's why it's a serious problem. We're looking at a paper where everything is done correctly. And let me try and review what that means. This is the introductory paragraph to a paper on saving the Colorado River Delta. And in fact, the title already tells me something, and that's good. I really appreciate it, and all faculty do, when a student actually thinks of a title, because it means that they are thinking about the topic and they have something in mind for their paper. So advice to you is don't just put paper 1 or paper on the US-Mexico border. You've written a paper on something more specific. Try to use the title as a place to tell the reader what's coming up. Now, this introduction is really good for several reasons. And since we've been talking about writing in your own words, plagiarism and using quotes and citing sources, I'll just address that first and say that in this paper, there's nothing plagiarized. There's nothing at all plagiarized. So everything has been written and attributed correctly, but more importantly, there aren't any quotes. And so this student has actually thought through the material and written it up in her own words. And that is a much stronger paper than a paper that has quotes at all. This particular assignment, and in most of the assignments from my classes, there just isn't really any need for quotes anywhere. And when I see quotes, what I think is the student didn't want to take the time to think it through themselves, so they just stuck in what someone else wrote. When I don't see any quotes, and also the writing is clear and clean, I know the student has thought through the material, because she had to gather research. She's got a bibliography with, 5, 6, 7 items in it, and she had to read stuff that other people wrote, and she had to think about it. And she did. And I see this in a number of ways. So she starts off with kind of taking a bit of a distance from the topic, which is saving the Colorado River Delta, and that doesn't even appear in the first 2 sentences. First, she says water is essential for not only survival, but for prosperity. So that sort of tells us, oh, well, okay, so this topic about the Colorado River Delta matters because water really matters. Okay, and then in the western United States, many take for granted the abundance of this natural resource that is not necessarily native to their state. So now she's also saying that people tend to take water for granted, and the suggestion would be, I think you would agree with me, that maybe her paper is that we shouldn't be doing that. And so we already got that. This is a topic that matters because water is essential, and we got that it's taken for granted, but we really shouldn't. And that's just in 2 sentences. So this tells me that she's just thought about it, and I like that she's been a little bit creative, and she is situating her paper in something bigger than just the topic itself. And now she comes to the Colorado River. She's narrowing down, as you see, first with water, then the western the U.S., and then the Colorado River. The paper's not about the Colorado River. The paper is about the Colorado River's delta. That's what it's about. But here she narrows down more and tells us something about the Colorado River, that it provides water to over 30 million people in 7 different states, and here's this number 1, which is her reference. And so she has used her own words, but she's citing the source. Where did she get this? She got it from Ward 2001. And we can go to her bibliography and we'll find what that is. Is it a book? Is it an article? We'll discover that in her bibliography. Now she says, in addition to these states, the river also provides water to Mexico, where the lower basin of the river creates a Colorado River Delta. This is really a perfect introduction because she's gone from the most general, coming down within 5 lines, to the topic of her paper. Now we can situate it. We know that the Colorado River Delta is the delta of that river, that the river flows through 7 states in the United States, that it serves over 30 million people. She's done this in her own words, and she's done it in 6 lines. It's really, really well done. And now that she's come to the delta, she starts to tell us more about it, because after all, why do we care? She needs to make us care. It's the introduction. So she says that this delta creates the largest and most critical wetland for avian and aquatic species of concern, and even in its depleted state is the largest wetland in southwest North America. Well, okay, that makes me think the delta's important. And there's a citation again. And then here's the problem. The delta, however, is being devastated by the heavy diversions to its water source, the Colorado River. So now she's brought me in more, because now she's not just telling me it's an area that matters, but it's an area that matters with a problem. And she continues to explain that the delta receives only a fraction of its natural flow, and even that has high salinity. Okay, so she's setting up that there's a problem. And now she turns it around and she says, yet despite the delta's shrunken and contaminated water supply, there is still hope of recovering its endangered wetlands. The Colorado River Delta can be restored if the U.S. and Mexico recognize the delta as a stakeholder in the battle over riparian rights. So she's taken us from not knowing anything about the topic into where it's located, what the problem is, and the fact that there's some hope for it, and here's how that will come about. This is a masterful introduction, and it was all written by the student, and it could only be written because she thought about her different sources down here, what the material was, and she brought them together in her own way to create a really nice introduction to her paper.